Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah with Got Safety here with today's lesson on air compressors. Remember to sign off on your mobile device to receive credit for this training. If you feel the need to pause this video at any time to have a discussion, we encourage you to do so. Compressed air is one of the most popular sources of energy in today's work environments. It powers a wide variety of tools and equipment, as well as large machines and process lines. Benefits of compressed air include low maintenance costs, a low weight to power ratio, and the ability to operate for long periods without overheating. The dangers of using compressed air are compared to the use of electricity. Just like electricity, compressed air can be deadly if not treated with respect and used properly. In this lesson, we'll discuss the power and dangers of cleaning with compressed air, cleaning your compressor, exceptions to cleaning with compressors, hearing protection, and how to inspect and maintain your compressor. Like any tool or piece of equipment, air compressors must be regularly inspected and maintained. In general, before using compressed air equipment, always inspect it and make sure everything is in good working order. Hoses should be checked carefully for any sign of damage. Air hoses with cracks or other damage should be removed from service. Air fittings and couplings should also be inspected. They should fit tightly into the hose and be clamped securely with an approved machine clamp. If couplings require locking pins, make sure they are in place before use. Never use homemade air nozzles. Keep tools that are used with a compressed air in good working condition. If a tool is dropped, inspect it for dents and bends. Do not carry tools by the hose. Test the valve of the compressor regularly. Never remove the guarding around the belt and shaft of the compressor motor.
Hey everyone, if you just watched this video and are thinking, how do I get more of these videos? Click on this link or go to gotsafety.com and we'll show you how you can digitally sign and record employee training records, build custom forms, or even access your OSHA documentation. Go to gotsafety.com right now or call 1-800-734-3574 for more information.